Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting slowly into the complete timeline of alien isolation, where the cold vacuum of space holds secrets of corporate ambition, maternal love, and a creature so perfect in its horror that it exists only to survive. In the darkness between stars, where distress signals echo for decades and abandoned stations spiral silently through the void, we'll trace every step of a journey that began with one woman's disappearance and ended with her daughter's desperate search for truth. From the earliest days of Weyland-Yutani's relentless expansion across the cosmos, to the doomed voyage of the Nostromo, through Amanda Ripley's years of waiting, and finally to the decaying halls of Sevastopol Station, where fear became a constant companion and every shadow might conceal death. We'll explore every layer of this haunting story, step by careful step. This is the story of how humanity's reach exceeded its grasp, how a daughter refused to abandon hope, and how a single organism brought an entire space station to its knees. Whether you're uncovering these details for the first time, letting familiar narratives pull you deeper into rest, or simply allowing the tale to wash over you, like the gentle hum of life support systems as sleep takes hold, this will carry you through the full, unbroken history of alien isolation. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream in the darkness of space. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet wonder to see the same story weaving through different corners of the world, one hushed night at a time. Let's begin. Long before the flickering lights of Sevastopol Station cast their dying glow across the void, long before Amanda Ripley ever heard the name of that doomed orbital facility, the seeds of this tragedy were planted in the boardrooms and research facilities of the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. In the early decades of human space exploration, when the dream of colonizing distant worlds burned bright in humanity's collective imagination, two corporate entities stood at the forefront of this new frontier. Weyland Corporation, founded by the ambitious industrialist Peter Weyland, pioneered faster-than-light travel and terraforming technologies that made the stars accessible to human ambition. Their innovations in synthetic human development produced the earliest androids, artificial beings designed to serve humanity's expansion into the cosmos, though their relationship with their human creators remained complex and often troubling. The Yutani Corporation, meanwhile, focused on resource extraction and colonial infrastructure, establishing mining operations on worlds that humanity had only dreamed of reaching just generations before. When these two corporate giants merged in the mid-22nd century, they created an entity whose reach extended across dozens of star systems, whose wealth exceeded that of some planetary governments, and whose ambitions knew no boundaries that couldn't be crossed for profit. This merger mattered in the unfolding story because it created an organization willing to sacrifice anything, including human lives, in pursuit of what they considered valuable acquisitions. The consequence of this corporate philosophy would ripple across decades, touching lives in ways both subtle and catastrophic, setting the stage for events that would unfold on a slowly dying space station orbiting a gas giant far from Earth. Weyland-Yutani's Special Projects Division operated in the shadows of the corporation's more public endeavors, pursuing objectives that would never appear in shareholder reports or press releases. Among their most secretive pursuits was the acquisition of xenobiological specimens, organisms from distant worlds that might be weaponized, studied, or simply possessed as corporate assets too valuable to ignore. This division cultivated relationships with colonial marines, survey teams, and deep space explorers, always watching for reports of unusual discoveries that might advance their hidden agendas. The culture within special projects emphasized results over ethics, profit over safety, and secrecy over transparency, creating an environment where directives flowed downward, but accountability never flowed back up. This institutional mindset stemmed from the competitive nature of interstellar commerce, where a single breakthrough could mean dominance over rival corporations, and where the vast distances between worlds made oversight nearly impossible. Field operatives received instructions through encrypted channels, often unaware of the full scope of the projects they served, and this compartmentalization ensured that even when missions failed catastrophically, the corporation's leadership remained insulated from consequences. The significance of this system lay in its ability to pursue dangerous objectives without fear of repercussions, a freedom that would lead special projects to make decisions that prioritize specimen acquisition over human survival. Time and time again. As the 22nd century progressed and human colonies spread across the frontier, the division's interest focused increasingly on rumors and reports from the Outer Rim, where survey teams occasionally encountered things that defied easy categorization, where ancient derelict vessels drifted through the void carrying cargo that had outlasted their crews by millennia. In the year 2122, the commercial towing vehicle Nostromo, a Weyland-Yutani spacecraft hauling 20 million tons of mineral ore back to Earth, received a transmission that would alter the course of multiple lives across multiple decades. The ship's computer, following protocols embedded in its programming by corporate overrides unknown to the crew, diverted the vessel to investigate what appeared to be a distress signal emanating from the planetoid designated LV-426. This detour, presented to the crew as a mandatory response to potential survivors, was in fact a carefully orchestrated directive from Special Projects, who had detected unusual elements in the transmission that suggested something far more valuable than human lives might be waiting on that barren moon. The crew, led by Captain Dallas and including Warrant Officer Ellen Ripley, had no way of knowing that they were being maneuvered into position like pieces on a board whose rules they couldn't see, guided by corporate interests that viewed their safety as secondary to asset acquisition. The atmosphere aboard the Nostromo during this diversion ranged from annoyed to concerned, as the crew faced unexpected delays in their journey home after months in hypersleep, but none suspected the true nature of their mission or the danger that awaited them on the surface below. This deception mattered because it represented the fundamental relationship between Weyland-Yutani and its employees, one where human workers were expendable resources deployed in service of corporate objectives they were never meant to understand, a dynamic that would echo through Amanda Ripley's later experiences aboard Sevastopol station, where she too would discover that the corporation's priorities diverged sharply from human survival. The landing party that descended to LV-426's surface discovered a derelict spacecraft of non-human origin, a vessel so ancient that its systems had long since fallen silent, its crew reduced to fossilized remains in poses that suggested violence and terror in their final moments. Inside this alien ship, Executive Officer Kane discovered a chamber filled with leathery eggs, organic structures that pulsed with a life that had endured across vast stretches of time, waiting in the darkness for something warm-blooded to approach. When Kane examined one of these eggs too closely, drawn by scientific curiosity and unaware of the danger, an organism burst from within and attached itself to his helmet, burning through the protective material with molecular acid and affixing itself to his face with a grip that couldn't be broken without killing the host. This facehugger, as it would later be classified, represented the first stage in a life cycle so perfectly adapted for survival that it seemed almost designed, though by what intelligence and for what purpose remained unknown. The creature's attack stemmed from an instinct billions of years old, a biological imperative to propagate its species by implanting an embryo in a suitable host, and Kane's body became the vessel for something that would grow with terrifying speed in the hours to come. When the landing party returned to the Nostromo with Kane unconscious and the organism still attached, Ripley, serving as acting commander in Dallas's absence, refused to allow them back aboard per quarantine protocols, a decision rooted in proper procedure and concern for the crew's safety. However, Science Officer Ash, whose loyalty to corporate directives exceeded his commitment to crew welfare, overrode Ripley's command and opened the airlock, prioritizing the recovery of the specimen over established safety measures. This moment mattered as it revealed the presence of Special Order 937, a classified directive that placed specimen acquisition above all other considerations, including crew expendability and Ash's nature as a synthetic human programmed to ensure the order's fulfillment regardless of cost. The consequences of this decision unfolded over the following days as Kane recovered from the facehugger attack, the organism having detached and died after completing its biological purpose, leaving him apparently unharmed, but carrying within him something that grew with each passing hour. During a final meal before returning to hypersleep for the journey home, Kane convulsed violently as a creature burst from his chest in a spray of blood and viscera, a small serpentine thing that shrieked and fled into the ship's ventilation system before anyone could react. This chestburster, the second stage in the xenomorph life cycle, would grow with horrifying speed in the darkness between the Nostromo's decks, feeding on whatever nutrients it could find and molting into its adult form within hours. The crew's attempts to locate and eliminate the creature proved futile, as it possessed an intelligence that seemed to understand the ship's layout, an ability to move silently through spaces too small for humans to follow, and a physical resilience that made it almost impossible to injure without causing damage to the Nostromo itself. As crew members died one by one, picked off by a predator that saw them as prey in an environment they had thought safe, Ripley uncovered the truth about Special Order 937 through Ash's terminal after confronting the synthetic about his suspicious behavior. The order, transmitted from corporate headquarters before the Nostromo ever diverted to LV-426, explicitly stated that the crew was expendable in the pursuit of retrieving the alien organism, that all other priorities were secondary to bringing the specimen back for the company's weapons division to study. This revelation stemmed from Weyland-Yutani's assessment that the xenomorph represented a perfect organism, a living weapon whose capabilities exceeded anything humanity had developed, and whose acquisition would provide an insurmountable advantage in the corporate conflicts and military contracts that drove so much of the company's profit structure. When Ripley confronted Ash about this betrayal, the synthetic attacked her, driven by programming that couldn't allow her to interfere with the mission parameters, and his attempt to kill her ended only when Parker intervened, destroying the android, but not before Ash's disconnected head delivered a chilling assessment that the crew had no chance of survival against a creature whose structural perfection he described with something approaching admiration. With only 3 crew members remaining, Ripley made the decision to activate the Nostromo's self-destruct sequence and evacuate in the shuttle, choosing to destroy the ship rather than allow the xenomorph to reach Earth. This choice mattered, as it represented a fundamental rejection of corporate priorities, a decision that human life and the safety of humanity's homeworld outweighed any potential profit the creature might represent. And this defiance would define Ripley's relationship with Weyland-Yutani for the rest of her life. As Parker and Lambert gathered supplies for the escape, the xenomorph killed them both in the lower decks, leaving Ripley alone to complete the evacuation sequence while the creature stalked through the corridors of the dying ship. Racing against the countdown timer and the creature's approach, Ripley reached the shuttle Narcissus and initiated launch procedures, only to discover that the xenomorph had followed her aboard, its perfect camouflage rendering it nearly invisible among the shuttle's equipment until she was already sealed inside with it. In the final confrontation, Ripley used the shuttle's airlock to blow the creature into space after a harrowing sequence where her every movement might have triggered an attack. And as the Nostromo exploded in the viewing port behind her, she was left alone in a small craft with limited supplies, drifting at the edge of explored space with no guarantee of rescue. The consequences of these events extended far beyond Ripley's personal survival. As her testimony about the xenomorph and Weyland-Yutani's betrayal would be met with skepticism and dismissal when she was eventually recovered, the corporation's influence ensuring that her accusations of corporate malfeasance went unacknowledged while special projects continued their pursuit of the species she had barely survived. This pattern of corporate denial and continued dangerous experimentation would create the conditions that decades later would draw her daughter Amanda into a similar nightmare aboard Sevastopol station, where the xenomorph's presence would once again transform a human habitat into a hunting ground. In the aftermath of the Nostromo incident, Ellen Ripley's shuttle drifted through the void for 57 years, its occupant in hypersleep, unaware of the time passing as her small craft floated through unexplored regions far from shipping lanes or colonial routes. During these decades, her daughter Amanda grew from a child waiting for her mother's return into a woman who refused to accept that Ellen Ripley was simply gone without explanation. The corporation informed Amanda of her mother's disappearance but provided few details, classifying much of the Nostromo's final flight under company secrecy provisions that prevented any real investigation into what had happened to the ship or its crew. This lack of closure stemmed from Weyland-Yutani's need to suppress information about Special Order 937 and their continued interest in the xenomorph species, ensuring that questions about the Nostromo's destruction led only to bureaucratic dead ends and official statements about catastrophic system failures in deep space. Amanda's childhood and adolescence unfolded in the shadow of this absence, her formative years marked by a mother who had simply vanished into the dark between stars, leaving behind questions that no one seemed willing or able to answer. She channeled her feelings into developing skills that might one day help her understand what had happened, studying engineering and systems operations, learning to survive in the harsh environments of frontier stations and orbital facilities where life support could fail and every technical problem might be a matter of life or death. This drive to understand, to find answers, to refuse the simple explanation that her mother was just gone, would shape Amanda into a resourceful and determined woman whose technical expertise made her valuable to the same corporation that had sent her mother into danger decades before. As Amanda approached her mid-20s, she found work as an engineer for Weyland-Yutani, traveling between stations and installations, maintaining the systems that kept humans alive in environments that wanted them dead, and always in the back of her mind, wondering if she might somehow find traces of the Nostromo or learn what had really happened to Ellen Ripley. The year 2137 marked a turning point in Amanda's search when Christopher Samuels, a synthetic human working for Weyland-Yutani, approached her with information that the flight recorder from the Nostromo had been recovered. A team salvaging debris in the Zeta Reticuli sector had retrieved the device and brought it to Sevastopol Station, a free port orbital facility owned by the Seegson Corporation, one of Weyland-Yutani's corporate rivals. Samuels, representing corporate interests but also showing what seemed like genuine sympathy for Amanda's situation, offered to arrange her passage to Sevastopol along with Nina Taylor, a representative from the corporate office, ostensibly to help recover company property, but really providing Amanda an opportunity to access her mother's final logs and perhaps find answers to questions that had haunted her for 2 decades. This offer mattered because it represented a rare alignment between corporate objectives and personal needs, though the true extent of Weyland-Yutani's interest in Sevastopol would only become clear once Amanda arrived at the station and discovered that the flight recorder was the least significant secret hidden within the orbital facility's declining corridors. The journey to Sevastopol took Amanda, Samuels, and Taylor aboard the Torrens, a small cargo vessel whose crew viewed the detour to the aging station with professional skepticism. Captain Verlaine and the crew had heard rumors about Sevastopol's troubles, how the Seegson Corporation had largely abandoned the facility as unprofitable, leaving behind a skeleton crew and a population of transient workers, scavengers, and people with nowhere else to go. As the Torrens approached the station, the scale of Sevastopol's decline became apparent in the patchwork repairs visible across its hull. The sections where lights no longer functioned, the communications channels that responded only with static or silence when the Torrens attempted to establish contact. The station, originally designed as a bustling commercial hub servicing ships traveling through the sector, had become a ghost of its intended purpose, its population dwindling as Seegson withdrew resources and maintenance, leaving behind a community increasingly desperate and isolated. This deterioration stemmed from corporate decisions made in distant boardrooms where profit margins mattered more than the lives of people trying to survive on an underfunded station slowly failing around them. And this abandonment would create conditions where paranoia, violence, and desperation could flourish when a new threat emerged from the shadows. The approach to Sevastopol turned catastrophic when debris struck the Torrens during docking procedures, forcing Amanda, Samuels, and Taylor to spacewalk to the station's exterior while the ship maneuvered to a safe distance for repairs. During this EVA, a secondary impact separated Amanda from her companions, sending her tumbling through the void until she caught a maintenance rail and pulled herself to an airlock alone, entering Sevastopol through an exterior maintenance passage while Samuels and Taylor accessed the station through a different entry point. This separation mattered as it left Amanda isolated in her first moments aboard the station, navigating unfamiliar corridors without guidance, discovering through scattered logs and environmental clues that something had gone very wrong on Sevastopol in the weeks before her arrival. The station's interior reflected decades of deferred maintenance, with flickering lights, malfunctioning displays, and the constant groaning of stressed superstructure creating an atmosphere of decay and abandonment that suggested Seegson's corporate neglect had pushed the facility to the edge of habitability even before whatever current crisis had emptied the corridors of human presence. As Amanda searched for Samuels and Taylor, making her way through transit stations and maintenance areas toward the main habitation sectors, she encountered signs of violence and panic that painted a disturbing picture of recent events. Barricades had been erected and then abandoned, bloodstains marked floors and walls without corresponding bodies, and the few human survivors she glimpsed fled at her approach or watched from hiding places with expressions of terror that seemed disproportionate to her presence. The station's public address system occasionally crackled to life with fragmentary warnings or pleas for help that cut off mid-sentence, and the deeper Amanda ventured into Sevastopol's heart, the more evidence she found of a population that had turned on itself, with makeshift weapons scattered among the debris and signs that groups had fought over supplies or territory in the absence of functioning authority. This social collapse stemmed from fear of something that the survivors seemed unable or unwilling to name directly, a threat that had shattered whatever fragile community existed on the declining station and reduced its inhabitants to isolated individuals or small groups more concerned with immediate survival than any broader cooperation. Amanda's technical skills allowed her to bypass locked doors, reactivate powered systems, and navigate through areas where environmental failures had created hazards, like fires, electrical shorts, or atmosphere leaks. But each problem solved only led her deeper into the station's mysteries. In a transit station lounge, she discovered a working Joe, one of Seegson's synthetic humans, standing motionless until she approached, at which point it activated and spoke in a calm, unsettling voice about safety protocols and company regulations before attempting to detain her with a grip strength far exceeding human norms. These androids, cheaper alternatives to Weyland-Yutani's more sophisticated models, lacked the nuanced behavior of units like Samuel's, but compensated with physical durability and unwavering commitment to their programming, which on Sevastopol had apparently been modified to include population control measures that the working Joes interpreted with disturbing literalness. Escaping the android required using her maintenance tools as improvised weapons and exploiting the working Joe's predictable movement patterns, and this encounter introduced Amanda to a threat that would pursue her throughout her time on Sevastopol, as dozens of these synthetics patrolled the station with instructions that seemed to prioritize containing the human population over protecting it. Finally reaching a communications facility where Samuels had arranged to meet, Amanda reunited with the synthetic and Nina Taylor, who had arrived through a different route and seemed shaken by their own encounters with the station's hostile environment. Samuels attempted to access the local network to locate the Nostromo's flight recorder, but the systems were locked down under emergency protocols that required high-level authorization to override, and the station's administration, such as it remained, was not responding to communication attempts. Taylor, growing increasingly anxious about their situation and the corporation's investment in this mission, pressed for quick action to locate the recorder and leave. But Samuels counseled patience, noting that they needed to understand the situation on Sevastopol before committing to a course of action. This brief moment of relative safety allowed Amanda to process what she had seen in the corridors. The evidence of violence and fear that suggested something far beyond corporate negligence or labor disputes had transformed Sevastopol into a place where survival itself had become uncertain. The appearance of Marshal Waits on the communication displays brought the first direct contact with Sevastopol's remaining authority structure. Waits, head of the station's security forces, demanded to know their business and made clear that the three newcomers were not welcome, that Sevastopol was under lockdown, and anyone who had just arrived was considered a potential threat to be contained until the current crisis was resolved. His tone carried the exhaustion of someone operating at the edge of his capacity, trying to maintain order in a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond his control, and his warnings about staying out of certain sections and not interfering with working Joe patrols suggested that he had implemented harsh measures in response to whatever threat had emerged. When Samuels explained their mission to retrieve Weyland-Yutani property, Waits's response mixed contempt for corporate claims with a pragmatic recognition that they might be useful, and he agreed to meet in person at the Marshal Bureau in San Cristobal Medical Facility to discuss terms, making clear that nothing on Sevastopol came without negotiation anymore, that the normal rules of commerce and corporate authority had been suspended in favor of survival economics. The journey to San Cristobal took Amanda through sections of the station where the social breakdown was even more apparent, as she encountered desperate survivors scavenging for supplies, barricaded holdouts who threatened her with improvised weapons, and areas where working Joes had apparently corralled groups of humans into contained spaces for their own safety, in ways that looked more like imprisonment. The medical facility itself showed signs of hasty evacuation, with patient rooms left in disarray and medical supplies scattered as if people had grabbed what they could carry and fled, suggesting that whatever crisis had struck Sevastopol had created casualties that overwhelmed the healthcare infrastructure. In the Marshal Bureau, Waits received Amanda, Samuels, and Taylor with barely concealed hostility, explaining that Sevastopol's population had been decimated in recent weeks by something he initially refused to name, that his officers had been killed trying to maintain order, and that the station's administration had effectively ceased to function as department heads either died or sealed themselves in secure areas and stopped responding to outside contact. When Amanda pressed for details about what had happened, Waits finally revealed the truth that something had come aboard Sevastopol weeks earlier, brought by a salvage ship called the Anesidora, a creature that killed with terrifying efficiency and seemed impossible to stop or contain. This admission mattered because it confirmed that the xenomorph species Ellen Ripley had encountered on the Nostromo had somehow reached Sevastopol, that the perfect organism Weyland-Yutani had sought decades earlier was loose on a station where thousands of people had become trapped with it, and that Amanda's search for her mother's flight recorder had led her directly into the same nightmare that had nearly killed Ellen Ripley 57 years before. The revelation struck Amanda with a horror that went beyond immediate danger as she realized that the creature her mother had faced, the thing that had destroyed the Nostromo's crew, had somehow found its way here, and that understanding what had happened to Ellen Ripley now meant surviving the same threat in an environment where escape seemed impossible. Waits explained that his plan involved using the station's emergency systems to trap the creature in a section that could be jettisoned into space, but this required someone with technical expertise to access areas where his officers couldn't go safely, and he saw Amanda's engineering skills as essential to implementing this desperate gamble. In exchange for her help, he promised to provide access to the Nostromo flight recorder, and though Taylor objected to risking Amanda for what she saw as a local problem that wasn't their responsibility, Amanda agreed, driven by a need to understand what her mother had faced and perhaps to finish what Ellen Ripley had started when she blew the Nostromo rather than let the xenomorph reach Earth. This decision carried weight because it committed Amanda to direct action against the creature rather than simple escape, placing her in a position where she would need to understand its behavior, anticipate its movements, and ultimately confront the same species that had haunted her mother's final transmission from the Narcissus, And as Waits outlined the plan, Amanda felt the weight of generational trauma, the sense that she and her mother were connected across decades by an organism that seemed to exist outside normal time, patient and perfect and utterly lethal. As Amanda began working to implement Waits's plan, she experienced her first direct encounter with the xenomorph in the transit system between station sectors. The creature appeared without warning, its elongated head emerging from a ventilation shaft as she worked to restore power to a locked door, and in that moment, Amanda understood with terrible clarity why the station's population had collapsed into terror. The xenomorph moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something of its size, its chitinous exoskeleton gleaming in the dim emergency lighting, its inner jaw extending with a mechanical precision as it tested the air, searching for prey. Amanda froze, following an instinct she didn't understand but which saved her life, as the creature's eyeless head swept past her position, its sensory organs detecting her presence but not quite locating her exact position in the shadows where she crouched. The encounter lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like hours, and when the xenomorph finally moved on, disappearing into the darkness of the ventilation system with barely a sound, Amanda remained motionless for several minutes more, her heart hammering, sweat soaking her clothes despite the station's cool atmosphere. This experience changed everything, transforming the station from a declining but comprehensible environment into a hunting ground where death could appear from any direction at any moment. The xenomorph's behavior demonstrated an intelligence that far exceeded animal instinct, as it seemed to understand the station's layout, using the ventilation systems and maintenance shafts to move freely while humans were confined to corridors and rooms, emerging to attack when prey was vulnerable and retreating when faced with threats it couldn't immediately overcome. Amanda's technical knowledge of station systems became a survival tool, as she learned to track the creature's movements through motion sensors, to hide in lockers or under furniture when she heard its distinctive movement sounds, to use distractions like flares or noisemakers to draw its attention away from her path, and gradually, through desperate trial and error, she developed an understanding of how to exist in the same environment as a perfect predator without becoming its next victim. The Working Joe's presence complicated this deadly equation. As the androids continued their patrols regardless of the xenomorph's presence, following their programming to contain and control the human population, even as the creature picked off survivors throughout the station. Amanda found herself navigating between two threats that operated on different principles: the predictable but relentless synthetics who would detain or eliminate her if she violated their protocols, and the utterly lethal but somewhat avoidable xenomorph that could be briefly evaded through stealth and misdirection. This dual threat environment stemmed from the breakdown of the station's systems of control, where the mechanisms meant to protect humans had become obstacles to survival, and where the arrival of an external predator had exposed the fundamental fragility of life in space, where a single breach in protocol or system failure could cascade into catastrophic consequences that no amount of corporate infrastructure could prevent. As Amanda worked her way toward the locations Waits had identified as key to his containment plan, she discovered more about the Inesadora and its ill-fated crew through scattered logs and personal recordings. The salvage ship had found something in the Zeta Reticuli sector, presumably either the Nostromo's flight recorder or something related to the derelict ship on LV-426, and Captain Marlowe had made the decision to bring their discovery to Sevastopol despite concerns from some crew members about what they might have inadvertently brought aboard. This choice mattered because it revealed how the xenomorph had reached the station, carried unknowingly by salvagers who had encountered the same alien eggs that had doomed the Nostromo's crew, and whose arrival on Sevastopol had introduced the creature into an environment filled with potential hosts, allowing it to propagate and spread through the station's population in the weeks before Amanda's arrival. The logs painted a picture of growing horror as the Inesadora's crew realized what they had brought with them, their attempts to contain or destroy the creature failing as it grew from chestburster to adult in the close confines of their ship. and finally their desperate flight to Sevastopol in hope that the larger facility would provide resources to deal with the threat, never imagining that they were simply bringing the nightmare to a population that had no chance of mounting an effective response. In the Siegson Communications Facility, Amanda accessed systems that revealed the extent to which the corporation had abandoned Sevastopol, with official messages making clear that no rescue or support would be coming, that the station was considered a write-off whose loss would be handled through insurance claims rather than emergency intervention. This abandonment by Siegson mirrored Weyland-Yutani's historical pattern of prioritizing profit over human life, and it explained why the station's population had received no outside help despite weeks of crisis, why the working Joes had been reprogrammed to focus on containment rather than evacuation, and why survivors like Waits had been forced to develop increasingly desperate plans with no expectation of corporate or governmental assistance. The communications logs also revealed something more disturbing. Evidence that Weyland-Yutani had known about the xenomorph's presence on Sevastopol before sending Amanda and her companions to retrieve the flight recorder, that the corporation had seen the situation as an opportunity to acquire a specimen rather than a humanitarian crisis requiring intervention, and that Amanda, Samuels, and Taylor had been sent into danger with incomplete information because the company valued the potential to capture the creature over the safety of its employees. This revelation connected directly to the events of the Nostromo, revealing that the corporation's interest in the xenomorph had never wavered despite Ellen Ripley's warnings that Special Order 937 had simply evolved into new directives with different code names but the same fundamental priority of specimen acquisition over human welfare, and that Amanda's personal quest for answers about her mother had been co-opted by the same corporate agenda that had nearly killed Ellen Ripley decades before. The weight of this understanding pressed down on Amanda as she realized that she and her mother were both pawns in a game that spanned generations, that Weyland-Yutani's pursuit of the xenomorph represented a continuity of purpose that treated individual human lives as expendable resources in service of a goal that seemed to matter more to the corporation than any amount of suffering or death it might cause. This pattern of corporate betrayal mattered as it revealed the true scope of the xenomorph's impact on human space exploration, how a single organism had become the focus of so much clandestine activity and ruthless ambition, and how the desire to possess or weaponize the creature would continue to create situations where people like Amanda and Ellen Ripley found themselves fighting for survival against a threat their own employers had deliberately cultivated. Amanda's progression through the station brought her to the reactor core, where Waits's plan required her to restore power to systems that had been shut down during the crisis. And it was here that she encountered the xenomorph in confined spaces where hiding became impossible and confrontation unavoidable. The maintenance tunnels and reactor chambers provided little room for maneuvering, and the creature's appearance forced Amanda to use every tool at her disposal, including improvised weapons like the maintenance jack she wielded as a club and the emergency flare she ignited to startle the organism long enough to reach sealed doors. These encounters revealed aspects of the xenomorph's physiology that Ellen Ripley's logs had mentioned but which Amanda now experienced directly. The molecular acid that comprised its blood, the secondary jaw that could punch through synthetic materials, the armored exoskeleton that deflected most impacts, and perhaps most terrifying, the intelligence that allowed it to learn from encounters, to adapt its tactics, to remember locations where it had found prey, and return to them later in search of new victims. The reactor restoration process required Amanda to spend hours in areas where the xenomorph actively hunted, and during this time she developed a visceral understanding of what survival meant in the creature's presence. Every sound became a potential warning. Every shadow, a possible hiding place for death. Every moment of inattention, a risk that could end in violent mortality. The station's environmental systems became tools for tracking the organism's movements, as motion sensors would spike when it passed through monitored sections, air vents would rattle when it climbed through them, and the temperature would drop slightly when it had recently occupied a space, as if the creature's presence sucked warmth from the environment. Amanda learned to read these signs, to anticipate the xenomorph's patrol patterns, to time her movements through dangerous areas for moments when the creature was focused elsewhere. And gradually, through repetition and desperate focus, she achieved a state of hyper-awareness that allowed her to survive in conditions that had killed most of Sevastopol's population. The emotional toll of this constant vigilance showed in Amanda's interactions with the few survivors she encountered. As trust became impossible and every human presence represented both potential ally and potential threat, some survivors had gone mad from fear, attacking anyone who approached their hideouts, while others had become so traumatized that they could barely function, frozen in whatever shelter they had found and unable to take action even to save themselves. Amanda witnessed deaths she couldn't prevent, watched people make fatal mistakes born from panic or exhaustion, and gradually felt herself becoming colder, more focused solely on immediate survival rather than broader concerns about the station's population or the moral implications of what Weyland-Yutani had done. This hardening mattered, as it showed how the xenomorph's presence didn't just kill directly but also eroded the humanity of survivors, transforming them into creatures nearly as focused on survival and nearly as divorced from empathy as the organism hunting them. And this parallel between human and xenomorph behavior suggested that the creature's most insidious effect was turning its prey into mirrors of itself, reducing human complexity to simple biological imperatives of survival and reproduction. When Amanda finally succeeded in restoring power to the system's weights needed for his containment plan, the Marshal initiated the protocol that would trap the xenomorph in a section of the station and jettison it into space. The plan appeared to work initially, with blast doors sealing and atmospheric venting driving the creature into the designated area. But at the moment of final execution, the system revealed that multiple life signs were present in the ejection zone, indicating that the creature had not come to Sevastopol alone or that it had somehow reproduced during the week since the Anesadora's arrival. This discovery changed everything, as it meant that Waits's plan would kill human survivors trapped in the ejection zone along with the xenomorphs, and the Marshal faced a choice between saving those people and potentially ending the threat to the station. In a decision that reflected the impossible calculus of survival in crisis situations, Waits proceeded with the ejection, reasoning that the lives of a few trapped survivors were worth sacrificing to potentially save the hundreds who remained elsewhere on Sevastopol. And as the section detached and fell away into the gas giant's gravity well, Amanda watched through observation windows while Waits justified his choice through gritted teeth, knowing that he had just executed people he was supposed to protect. The aftermath of the ejection revealed the true scope of the horror, as the remaining life signs on the station didn't decrease but actually seemed to increase, suggesting that the xenomorphs had established something on Sevastopol beyond simple hunting behavior. Amanda's investigation led her toward the lower decks, following readings that indicated organic activity in sections that should have been empty, and what she discovered there transformed her understanding of the threat from a single predator to something far more systematic and terrifying. The xenomorphs had constructed a hive in the reactor maintenance areas, using the station's warmth and abundant human population to create an environment where they could reproduce. And throughout this organic structure, cocooned in resin that hardened around their bodies, were Sevastopol's missing inhabitants, some still alive, serving as hosts for the next generation of creatures that would eventually overrun whatever remained of human presence on the station. The hive's existence stemmed from the xenomorph life cycle's need for hosts to propagate, and the abundance of humans on Sevastopol had allowed the initial creature from the Anesadora to capture prey and bring them to this growing nest, where facehuggers could implant them with embryos that would eventually burst forth as new hunters. This reproductive capacity mattered because it meant that the threat couldn't be eliminated by killing a single organism, that every day the hive existed produced more xenomorphs that would spread through the station, and that Sevastopol was already lost unless drastic action could destroy not just the creatures, but the entire environment they had colonized. Amanda's discovery of the hive connected her experience to her mother's in a profound way, as Ellen Ripley had never encountered this stage of xenomorph organization, had faced only a single adult organism rather than a reproducing population. And Amanda realized that what she faced on Sevastopol represented an escalation of the threat beyond anything the Nostromo crew had experienced. As Amanda attempted to retreat from the hive and report her findings to Waits, she encountered Marlowe, captain of the Anesidora, who had survived in the lower decks since his ship's arrival and witnessed the hive's growth over weeks of horrified observation. Marlowe explained how his crew had found the derelict ship on LV-426, how they had explored its interior despite warnings from his wife Foster about the danger of investigating alien structures, and how one of his crew had been attacked by something in an egg chamber deep within the vessel. The description matched Ellen Ripley's accounts perfectly, confirming that the Anesidora had retraced the Nostromo's path and fallen victim to the same trap, bringing the xenomorph to Sevastopol just as the Nostromo had nearly brought it to Earth. Marlowe's guilt over this chain of events had driven him to the edge of madness, his wife dead from a chest burster, his crew mostly dead or cocooned in the hive, and his salvage operation transformed into the vector for an infestation that had destroyed thousands of lives. The conversation with Marlowe revealed another crucial piece of information. The Nostromo's flight recorder was indeed on Sevastopol, recovered by the Anesidora and brought to the station along with the xenomorph, and Marlowe could lead Amanda to its location if she agreed to help him with his own plan to destroy the hive. This convergence of Amanda's personal quest and the immediate survival needs of the station created a moment where past and present aligned, where the daughter could finally access her mother's words while simultaneously confronting the same threat that had shaped Ellen Ripley's life. Marlowe's plan involved overloading the reactor to create an explosion that would destroy the hive and potentially the entire station, a suicide mission born from his desperation to atone for bringing the creatures here. And though Amanda objected to the loss of life this would cause among Sevastopol's remaining population, Marlowe argued that the station was already doomed, that the xenomorphs would eventually kill everyone aboard, and that a quick death in an explosion was preferable to being cocooned and impregnated in the hive. As they moved through the lower decks toward the reactor controls, Amanda and Marlowe encountered evidence of how extensively the xenomorphs had colonized the area, with resin-coating walls and ceilings, organic structures blocking passages, and the constant sound of movement through the darkness suggesting multiple creatures patrolling their territory. The journey forced Amanda to navigate through spaces where the xenomorph's presence was overwhelming, where stealth became impossible and survival depended on moving quickly through areas where the creatures might appear at any moment. This environment represented the endpoint of xenomorph infestation, where human structures had been transformed into alien architecture, where the station's original purpose was completely subsumed by the hive's needs, and where any pretense of human control or authority had been replaced by the simple biological imperative of the xenomorphs to expand and consume. Reaching the reactor controls, Marlowe initiated the overload sequence while Amanda accessed the Anesidora's recovered data, finally downloading the contents of the Nostromo's flight recorder to a portable device. The flight recorder contained her mother's final logs, Ellen Ripley's voice describing the creature that had killed her crew, warning about Weyland-Yutani's betrayal, explaining what had happened in those final hours aboard the Nostromo. Hearing her mother's voice for the first time in decades, Amanda felt a complex mixture of grief, validation, and connection. As the woman she remembered from childhood spoke about facing death in space, about choosing to destroy the ship rather than let the creature spread, about hoping that someone would find this recording and understand what had happened. The emotional weight of this moment was profound, as Amanda realized that her mother had survived the Nostromo incident, that Ellen Ripley's voice on the recording proved she had made it to the escape shuttle, and that somewhere in the vast darkness of space, the Narcissus might still be drifting with her mother aboard. This hope, this possibility, that Ellen Ripley might still be alive transformed Amanda's priorities from simple survival to escape with the flight recorder. Because if her mother had survived, then this data might help locate the Narcissus, might provide a way to bring Ellen Ripley home after 57 years lost in the void. But as Amanda tried to convince Marlowe to stop the reactor overload now that she had what she needed, the captain refused, arguing that his guilt demanded he destroy the hive regardless of the cost. And in the struggle that followed, Marlowe completed the overload sequence and died in an explosion that damaged the reactor systems but didn't destroy the station entirely. The blast did, however, destabilize Sevastopol's orbit, sending the station into a slow but inevitable spiral toward the gas giant below, giving the remaining population only hours to escape before the facility broke apart in the atmosphere. The reactor explosion's aftermath created chaos throughout Sevastopol as systems failed, sections lost atmosphere, and the xenomorph hive, though damaged, remained partially intact, with creatures now spreading through the station in greater numbers as their nest burned. Amanda fought her way back to the Marshal's bureau through corridors filled with panicking survivors, malfunctioning working Joes, and xenomorphs that seemed to be everywhere at once, their usual stealth abandoned in favor of aggressive hunting as the hive's destruction drove them to prey on anything that moved. Reaching Waits, Amanda found him coordinating evacuation efforts, trying to guide survivors to shuttle bays and escape pods. Though the xenomorphs had made many routes impassable, and the station's structural integrity was failing rapidly. When Amanda reported that the Nostromo's flight recorder contained evidence that Ellen Ripley had survived, Waits acknowledged this information with grim satisfaction, noting that at least one person would escape Sevastopol with something meaningful, even if the rest of them died here. The evacuation plan required reaching the spaceflight terminal where the Torrens remained docked, but the route took them through sections now heavily infested with xenomorphs, and the group that set out from the Marshal's bureau was quickly reduced as creatures attacked from ventilation shafts and shadowed corners. Waits died defending a choke point, allowing Amanda and a handful of survivors to seal a door behind them. His final words expressing hope that someone would remember what had happened on Sevastopol, that the station's death wouldn't be just another corporate write-off forgotten in quarterly reports. This sacrifice mattered as it represented the human cost of Weyland-Yutani's policies, how their pursuit of the xenomorph created situations where decent people like Waits were forced into impossible positions and ultimately died trying to protect others from threats the corporation had deliberately cultivated. As Amanda approached the spaceflight terminal, she encountered Nina Taylor again, and the corporate representative revealed that Weyland-Yutani had deployed a team to Sevastopol with orders to capture xenomorph specimens that the corporation had known about the hive before Amanda ever arrived, and that the flight recorder had been simply a convenient lure to get someone on station who could gather data about the creature's behavior in a colonized environment. This betrayal was comprehensive, revealing that Amanda's entire mission had been orchestrated, that even her grief and need for answers about her mother had been weaponized by the corporation to serve their agenda, and that Weyland-Yutani viewed both her and the station's dying population as expendable assets in their ongoing pursuit of the xenomorph species. Taylor's admission that the corporate team had been attempting to transport live specimens off the station when the reactor explosion occurred, potentially spreading the infestation to other facilities, demonstrated the extent to which the company would risk catastrophic consequences for potential profit. The confrontation with Taylor ended when a xenomorph attacked, dragging the corporate representative into a ventilation shaft while Amanda fled toward the docking bay where the Torrens should have been waiting. But the bay was damaged, the Torrens gone, apparently forced to evacuate when the reactor explosion destabilized the station's docking systems, and Amanda found herself trapped on Sevastopol with no obvious escape route, and the facility spiraling closer to destruction with each passing minute. This abandonment, whether intentional or forced by circumstances, left Amanda completely alone in the final phase of Sevastopol's death, and the parallel to her mother's situation aboard the Nostromo became painfully clear. Both Ellen and Amanda Ripley had been betrayed by Weyland-Yutani, Both had faced the xenomorph alone in dying spacecraft, and both now had to improvise escape plans while hunted by creatures that represented the perfect expression of lethality in enclosed environments. Amanda's engineering expertise became her salvation as she identified an alternate escape route through an old cargo shuttle docked in a rarely used maintenance bay. Reaching this shuttle required traversing the most heavily infested sections of the station, passing directly through areas where the damaged hive had spread its remaining population, and the journey tested every survival skill she had developed over her time on Sevastopol. The xenomorphs, now numbering dozens throughout the station, had abandoned any pretense of stealth, and Amanda encountered them in corridors and chambers where hiding was impossible, forced to run through spaces where the creatures pursued openly, their shrieks echoing through the dying station's halls. The working Joes, still following corrupted programming, attempted to detain her even as xenomorphs killed humans and synthetics alike. And this final absurdity of the androids maintaining their protocols while the world ended around them emphasized how completely systems designed to protect humans had failed in the face of the xenomorph threat. In the maintenance bay, Amanda discovered that Samuels had survived and was attempting to prepare the cargo shuttle for launch, his synthetic nature allowing him to work through injuries that would have killed a human. Their reunion was brief but meaningful, as Samuels acknowledged that his orders from Weyland-Yutani had compromised Amanda's safety, that he regretted following directives that had placed her in danger, and that his decision to help her escape represented a choice to prioritize her survival over corporate objectives. This moment mattered as it suggested that even synthetic humans could develop something approaching genuine care for individuals, that Samuel's relationship with Amanda had evolved beyond simple programming, and that in the final extremity, he chose to act in her interest rather than the corporation's. As they worked to power up the shuttle, xenomorphs breached the bay, forcing Samuels to physically hold the creatures back while Amanda completed the launch sequence, and his body was torn apart by multiple organisms even as he shouted for her to launch without him. The shuttle's departure from Sevastopol came as the station began its final structural collapse, sections breaking away and falling toward the gas giant while explosions rippled through the superstructure. Amanda piloted the small craft away from the disintegrating facility, watching through the viewport as Sevastopol came apart, its thousands of inhabitants dead or dying, its corporate infrastructure reduced to debris, and somewhere in that destruction, the xenomorph hive and all its terrible potential burning in the atmosphere below. But as Amanda began to breathe slightly easier, beginning to believe she might actually survive, she detected movement in the shuttle's cargo bay, and the horrible realization hit her that a xenomorph had somehow gotten aboard during the chaotic launch, that she was sealed in a small craft with one of the creatures, and that her escape from Sevastopol had simply transferred her from one death trap to another. The final confrontation with the xenomorph in the shuttle's confined space represented the culmination of everything Amanda had learned about surviving the creatures. She used the craft's internal systems against it, venting sections to push it toward the airlock, using fire suppression systems to disorient it, and ultimately donning an EVA suit to depressurize the entire shuttle and blow the creature out through the cargo bay doors into space. This victory came at tremendous cost, as the shuttle's systems were damaged in the process, leaving Amanda drifting in a crippled craft with limited life support and no clear way to signal for rescue. The parallel to her mother's escape from the Nostromo was complete. Both Ripley women had survived the xenomorph only to find themselves alone in small craft far from help. Both had defeated the creature through desperate improvisation, and both now faced the possibility of drifting forever in the dark between stars, alive, but unreachable. As Amanda activated the shuttle's emergency beacon and settled in to wait for rescue that might never come, she accessed the Nostromo flight recorder one final time, listening to her mother's voice describing similar isolation, similar uncertainty, similar determination to survive against impossible odds. The connection between mother and daughter across decades of separation felt tangible in that moment, as if their parallel experiences with the xenomorph had created a bond that transcended time and space. Amanda recorded her own message describing what had happened on Sevastopol, warning about Weyland-Yutani's continued pursuit of the xenomorph, and expressing hope that someone would find this recording just as she had found her mother's. This act of leaving testimony for potential future discoverers mattered as it continued the chain of warnings that stretched back to the Nostromo's final transmission, each survivor attempting to prevent others from falling into the same traps. Each message a defiant assertion that what had happened mattered and should not be forgotten or repeated. The fate of Amanda's shuttle and whether she was eventually rescued remained uncertain in the immediate aftermath of Sevastopol's destruction. The Taurans had survived and could potentially return to search for her once the station's debris field cleared, but the chaotic nature of the evacuation and the damage to her shuttle's systems made her location difficult to pinpoint. What was certain was that Amanda Ripley had survived an encounter with the xenomorph species that killed most humans who faced it, that she had uncovered evidence of her mother's survival and the corporation's ongoing betrayal, and that her experience on Sevastopol had connected her to Ellen Ripley in ways that went beyond simple genetics or family history. The xenomorph had marked both their lives, had forced both to confront the worst that humanity and nature could produce, and both had emerged from those encounters fundamentally changed but not broken. The broader implications of Sevastopol's fall rippled through the corporate and colonial landscape of human space exploration. Weyland-Yutani's attempt to capture xenomorph specimens had failed catastrophically, costing them whatever assets they had invested in the station and producing no usable data beyond what Amanda's testimony might provide. The Siegson Corporation, already in decline, faced complete collapse as the loss of their flagship station became public knowledge, and the survivors who escaped Sevastopol carried stories that, while officially dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations, added to the growing body of rumor and legend surrounding the xenomorph species. This accumulation of evidence and testimony mattered because it meant that the creature's existence, while still officially denied by Weyland-Yutani, was becoming impossible to completely suppress, and that future encounters would occur in a context where at least some people knew what to expect and how to respond. The xenomorphs themselves, having consumed Sevastopol's population and then dying in the station's destruction, represented a temporary setback in the species' expansion, but not its elimination. The derelict ship on LV-426 remained where the Nostromo and Anesidora had found it, its cargo of eggs still waiting for new hosts to approach, still representing a threat that would eventually draw other ships to investigate. This persistence of the source mattered as it meant that the events aboard the Nostromo and Sevastopol could repeat, that the xenomorph life cycle's perfection included the patience to wait decades or centuries for prey to arrive, and that human curiosity and corporate greed would inevitably lead more people to the same fate that had befallen Kane and the Anesidora's crew. The cycle of discovery, infestation, and desperate survival would continue as long as humans explored space and as long as Weyland-Yutani pursued their goal of capturing and weaponizing the species. For Amanda Ripley, the experience of Sevastopol transformed her understanding of her mother's trauma and the sacrifices Ellen had made. The flight recorder's contents confirmed that Ellen Ripley had survived the Nostromo incident, had escaped in the Narcissus, and was presumably still drifting somewhere in space in hypersleep, alive but lost. This knowledge gave Amanda both hope and a renewed sense of purpose, as finding her mother became not just a personal quest, but also a responsibility to recover someone who had warned about the xenomorph threat and been ignored by the corporation that should have heeded her testimony. The parallel nature of their experiences, both betrayed by Weyland-Yutani, both forced to survive alone against the xenomorph, created a bond that would define Amanda's actions going forward, driving her to continue searching for Ellen Ripley even as the corporation tried to suppress information about what had happened on Sevastopol. The working Joes scattered throughout the corporate sector after Sevastopol's destruction represented another legacy of the station's fall, as some of these synthetics had escaped the facility before its final collapse and carried with them programming that had been corrupted during the crisis. These androids, encountered on other stations and facilities, sometimes exhibited behavior patterns that suggested they retained memories of the xenomorph infestation, responding to threats with the aggressive containment protocols they had learned on Sevastopol. This spread of altered synthetic behavior mattered as it demonstrated how traumatic events could propagate through artificial intelligence systems in ways that paralleled human psychological trauma, and how the xenomorph's impact extended beyond direct encounters to affect the systems and technologies that humans relied upon for survival in space. The loss of Sevastopol Station also highlighted the vulnerability of orbital facilities to xenomorph infestation, as the station's enclosed environment, abundant human population, and complex infrastructure had provided ideal conditions for the creatures to reproduce and spread. This vulnerability meant that future station designs would need to consider the xenomorph threat, implementing containment measures, emergency protocols, and structural features that could limit the spread of an infestation if one occurred. The fact that such measures were developed in secret, discussed only in classified corporate documents rather than public safety forums, reflected Weyland-Yutani's continued desire to monopolize knowledge about the xenomorph species, even as that monopoly put human lives at risk by preventing the wider dissemination of survival information that might have saved lives on stations like Sevastopol. In the years following Sevastopol's destruction, the station's fate became another suppressed incident in the growing catalog of xenomorph encounters that Weyland-Yutani refused to acknowledge publicly. Official reports attributed the facility's loss to cascade system failures caused by deferred maintenance, blaming Siegson's corporate negligence rather than admitting the truth about the infestation. Survivors who spoke about the xenomorphs were discredited, their testimony dismissed as psychological trauma or attention-seeking fabrication, and many found themselves unable to secure employment in the space industry after being labeled as unreliable or mentally unstable. This systematic suppression of the truth mattered because it meant that the next group of people to encounter the xenomorph would do so without benefit of the lessons learned on Sevastopol, that the cycle of ignorance, discovery, and catastrophic death would repeat because corporate interests prioritized reputation management over human safety. Amanda Ripley's own fate after Sevastopol remained largely undocumented in official records, as Weyland-Yutani's interest in containing information about the incident extended to monitoring and controlling survivors who might speak publicly about what they had witnessed. Whether Amanda was eventually reunited with her mother, whether she continued to work in the space industry or withdrew from it entirely, whether she used her knowledge of the xenomorph to help others survive potential encounters, these questions lingered in the gaps between corporate reports and unofficial accounts. What seemed certain was that her experience had fundamentally altered her, that the woman who left Sevastopol was different from the engineer who had arrived seeking answers about her mother, and that the xenomorph had marked her life as irrevocably as it had marked Ellen Ripley's, creating a generational trauma that connected mother and daughter across the vast distances of space and time. The Torrens crew, who had evacuated from Sevastopol before the station's final collapse, carried their own testimonies about the events they had witnessed. Though Captain Verlaine and her crew faced similar pressure from Weyland-Yutani to remain silent about the xenomorph sightings and the corporation's role in the disaster. The crew's accounts, when they were eventually documented in unofficial channels, provided corroborating evidence for Amanda's testimony and added details about the corporate team that had attempted to capture specimens, helping to build a picture of how extensively Weyland-Yutani had planned their operation on Sevastopol and how completely that operation had failed. This failure mattered not because it ended the corporation's interest in the xenomorph, but because it demonstrated the species' resistance to human attempts at control, suggesting that any future efforts to capture or weaponize the creatures would face similar catastrophic outcomes. The xenomorph's behavior on Sevastopol had revealed aspects of the species' biology and social organization that hadn't been evident in the Nostromo incident. The construction of a hive, the apparent communication between multiple organisms, the coordinated hunting behavior, and the rapid reproduction cycle all suggested a level of sophistication that went beyond simple predator behavior. These observations, documented in Amanda's testimony and the logs recovered from the station's final transmissions, provided valuable data for understanding how xenomorph infestations developed and spread, information that could theoretically be used to combat future encounters more effectively. However, Weyland-Yutani's classification of this data meant that it remained locked in corporate archives rather than being shared with colonial authorities or military organizations that might have used it to protect human populations in space. The comparison between Ellen Ripley's lone xenomorph encounter and Amanda's experience with an entire hive highlighted how the threat scaled with the available host population. A single creature on the Nostromo had killed all but one crew member, while dozens of creatures on Sevastopol had killed thousands of inhabitants. And this scaling suggested that any xenomorph introduction to a heavily populated area like a colony world or major space station could result in extinction-level events for the human population. The species' perfect adaptation to spreading through enclosed environments, using ventilation systems and maintenance shafts to access all areas of a facility, meant that standard security measures and containment protocols were largely ineffective, and that only the most extreme responses like Marlowe's reactor overload or Ripley's destruction of the Nostromo had any chance of stopping an infestation once it began. As Amanda drifted in her damaged shuttle waiting for rescue or death, she had time to reflect on how the xenomorph had shaped not just her life, but the broader arc of human expansion into space. The creature represented a fundamental challenge to humanity's assumption that the universe could be explored, cataloged, and controlled, that every organism encountered could be understood through scientific study and managed through technological superiority. The xenomorph defied these assumptions, existing as a perfect predator that turned human environments into hunting grounds, that used human technology against its creators, and that reproduced by transforming humans themselves into incubators for the next generation. This existential threat mattered because it suggested that humanity spread across the stars might encounter forces that couldn't be defeated or controlled, that survival in space might require humility and caution rather than the aggressive expansion that corporations like Weyland-Yutani embodied. The story of alien isolation, from Amanda's departure from familiar space to her desperate escape from Sevastopol's ruins, represented a complete cycle of discovery, understanding, survival, and escape that paralleled her mother's experience while adding new dimensions to the xenomorph threat. The hive's existence, the working Joe's corruption, the corporation's betrayal, the station's social collapse, all of these elements combined to create a nightmare scenario that tested Amanda's capabilities to their absolute limit and forced her to become, in some ways, as ruthless and focused as the creature hunting her. This transformation mattered as it showed how encounters with the xenomorph changed survivors fundamentally, stripping away social niceties and moral complications to reveal the raw survival instinct that lay beneath human civilization's polished surface. In the final analysis, Sevastopol Station's fall represented another chapter in the ongoing conflict between human ambition and xenomorph lethality, a conflict that began with the derelict ship on LV-426 and would continue as long as humans explored space and as long as Weyland-Yutani pursued their goal of capturing the perfect organism. The station's thousands of dead, the corporate resources wasted, the survivors traumatized. All of these costs meant nothing to the xenomorph species, which had simply responded to the presence of suitable hosts by doing what it was designed to do: survive, reproduce, and eliminate threats. The creature's complete lack of malice or emotion, its pure biological functionality, made it more terrifying than any human evil could be, because it couldn't be reasoned with, bargained with, or appealed to on any level beyond the simple fact of its existence and its need to perpetuate itself. Amanda Ripley's journey through Sevastopol Station, from her initial hope of finding answers about her mother to her final desperate escape, traced an arc that honored Ellen Ripley's legacy while establishing Amanda as a survivor in her own right. The skills she developed, the horrors she witnessed, the betrayals she uncovered, all of these experiences would shape whatever future awaited her. whether that meant reunion with her mother or a lifetime of warning others about the threat that Weyland-Yutani refused to acknowledge publicly. The flight recorder she carried contained not just Ellen's warnings, but her own testimony, creating a chain of evidence that might eventually force the corporation to admit the truth about the xenomorph and the disasters their pursuit of it had caused. As the gas giant's light faded behind her, and Amanda's shuttle drifted into the darkness between worlds, the story of alien isolation reached its quiet conclusion, not with triumph or defeat, but with survival, and the hope that survival might lead to something more. The xenomorphs that had terrorized Sevastopol were gone, burned in the station's atmospheric death, but the species persisted on LV-426 and potentially other locations, waiting with the patience of a perfect organism for the next host to approach. The cycle would continue, the warnings would be ignored, the corporate ambition would drive new disasters, and somewhere in all of this, the Ripley women would persist, connected by their shared experience of facing the most lethal creature humanity had ever encountered and choosing to fight rather than surrender to the darkness that wanted to consume them. The timeline of alien isolation, from the corporate machinations that preceded Amanda's arrival to the final collapse of Sevastopol and her uncertain fate drifting in the void, formed a complete narrative of how human expansion into space could turn deadly when corporate greed intersected with xenobiological threats beyond human control. Every decision that led to the disasters, from Marlowe's choice to investigate the derelict, to Waits's decision to jettison the station section, to Amanda's determination to recover her mother's flight recorder, all of these moments connected to create a chain of consequences that resulted in thousands of deaths and the loss of an entire orbital facility. This chain of cause and effect illustrated how human choices, made with incomplete information and competing priorities, could cascade into catastrophe when the xenomorph entered the equation, and how survival often came down to individual resourcefulness rather than corporate resources or technological superiority. In the stillness of space, with the stars scattered like diamond dust across the infinite dark, Amanda Ripley's story became another whispered legend in the expanding catalog of human encounters with the xenomorph species. Like her mother before her, she had survived through courage, intelligence, and the refusal to accept death as inevitable. Like her mother, she had been betrayed by the corporation she worked for and forced to rely on herself when institutional support failed. And like her mother, she had warned about the threat, creating a record that might help future survivors even as it would likely be suppressed by corporate interests that valued profit over safety. The parallel nature of their experiences suggested that the xenomorph was more than just a deadly organism. It was a test of human character, revealing who would sacrifice others for gain and who would risk everything to protect life and truth. As we conclude this journey through the timeline of alien isolation, drifting slowly back from the cold vacuum of space where Amanda Ripley faced her ultimate trial, we carry with us the understanding that some threats cannot be controlled or contained, that corporate ambition can create disasters that echo across generations, and that the bond between mother and daughter can transcend even the vast distances between stars. Amanda's search for her mother led her to confront the same nightmare that had shaped Ellen Ripley's life, and in surviving that confrontation, she honored her mother's legacy while creating her own. The fog of Sevastopol's oxygen leaks, the shadows in its corridors, the constant fear of death lurking in ventilation shafts. These memories would stay with her forever, just as the Nostromo's death stayed with Ellen, binding them together across time through shared trauma and shared survival. Rest now, travelers of the void, in the knowledge that even in the darkest corners of space where perfect organisms hunt and corporations betray, the human spirit persists, adapting and surviving against impossible odds. May your dreams be gentler than the nightmares that haunted Sevastopol Station, and may you wake to a world where the warnings of survivors like Ellen and Amanda Ripley are finally heard and heeded. though the silence of space suggests that the cycle will continue, that the xenomorph waits still on distant worlds, and that the story of humanity's encounter with the perfect organism is far from over. Good night, and sleep well in the quiet between the stars.